Good evening. Welcome. My name is Eric Banks. I'm the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for Too Dangerous for Words, Life and Death Reporting the Mexican Drug Wars. Tonight's panel is being presented on the occasion of the publication of Narcoland, the Mexican Drug Lords and Their Godfathers, by Anabel Hernández, who we're happy to have with us this evening. Joining Anabel tonight will be Carlos Lauría of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Nick Steinberg, senior researcher on Mexico in the Americas Division of the Human Rights Watch. I want to thank you all for coming this evening and say a special thank you to our co-organizer, the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, which has provided us with the venue this evening, and Verso Books, which is the publisher of Anabel Hernández's title. Unfortunately, one of our participants this evening, Guy Lawson, has been struck down by this nefarious little bug that's going around, in which you might be able to tell in my voice I have as well, and he could not rally to join us tonight, but we'll make do very well, I think, with our three panelists. I want to say a special thank you as well to the PEN American Center and the Committee to Protect Journalists, who are co-sponsors, as well as Stephanie Steicher, the Associate Director of the New York Institute for the Humanities, who became very enthusiastic on reading Anabel Hernández's book, and is really the major mover and shaker behind tonight's panel. In Mexico, the estimated number of deaths resulting from drug violence over the past 6 years is 70,000, and an exceedingly large number of those deaths exceedingly large number of people who have fallen prey to that violence include editors and journalists. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, Mexico ranks number 7 on something that they call the Impunity Index rating, which is an international per capita measure of unsolved journalist murders among the population, which makes it a slightly more dangerous place to be a journalist than Pakistan, and only marginally safer for journalists than Afghanistan. It's actually, I think, the second most dangerous place for journalists in the Americas, behind only Colombia. It should be pointed out that an ancillary result of the violence and threats against journalists is the rise of self-censorship in media outlets, with newspapers openly avowing that they will henceforth avoid covering any news regarding the drug cartels and political corruption around the cartels. So this violence has a circular effect. It further undermines the foundations of the free press in Mexico, and it has the effect of silencing those editors and journalists who would probe more deeply. I think we'll talk about this and many other issues this evening. While I bring up the theme of silence, this is a good time to remind you that if you have a cell phone on you, if you could check it and set it to silent, that would be very much appreciated. We also hope that you will join us after the event this evening. We'll have a small reception with some wine, and you can hopefully talk to the panelists. And we also have copies of the book on sale over here at this table. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Carlos Lauría, who will introduce our panelists and lead the discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening, and again, thanks to the New York Institute for the Humanities and the Carter Journalism Center for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished panelists. Top investigative Mexican journalist Anabel Hernández. Her book, Los Senores del Narco, or Narcoland, Mexican Drug Lords and Their Godfathers, just been published in English by Verso, has sold in Mexico 200,000 copies. It's a real sensation in Mexico's publishing industry. She will explain in detail what she has written in this incredible book. Nick Steinberg is a senior researcher on Mexico for one of the leading human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch, the Americas Division. He has done amazing work, in-depth reporting on human rights abuses in Mexico. More recently, a report on the disappeared people, more than 20,000 people disappeared, and forced disappearances in Mexico by organized crime and the security forces. So, you know, it's a great to have you here. Before I present Anabel and let her talk about her book, you know, I would like to provide some context about the situation for the press in Mexico. As Eric Banks was saying, in the last 6 years, more than 50 journalists have been killed or disappeared in this country. News outlets have been attacked with grenades, have been subject of many attacks with with gunfire, and the websites have been hacked. Violence tied to organized crime and corruption have devastated the news media, and more seriously, have stripped citizens of the rights to freedom of expression and access to information. There's widespread fear and censorship. This is curtailing the press ability to report the news, and more seriously, is placing Mexico's democracy, the future of Mexico's democracy, at risk. Compounding the problem of violence is a culture of widespread impunity. The collusion between authorities at all levels and organized crime is devastating the Mexican press and creating a problem for democratic stability. As I said, fundamental human rights are being affected, the rights to freedom of expression and access to information. The main stories that affect the daily lives of thousands of Mexico are not being reported fully. Anabel will tell you about the challenges facing investigative reporters when they do this kind of reporting. But you know, in Mexico, in many parts of Mexico now, investigative journalism has become an extinct profession. It's no longer possible to do investigative reporting. In this context, Anabel took 5 years to work on this book. She's again a leading reporter that has worked for national media outlets including Milenio, El Universal, Reforma, still a contributor for Reforma, and Proceso, which is a national news weekly magazine. She's award-winning reporter, and in this book she has described in detail why Mexico has become the base of Latin America's most powerful drug cartels. Not only that, but the complicity and collusion between high-ranking members of the government, businessmen, and even judges. Again, this book is a political and publishing sensation. Anabel, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and I really appreciate that you are here, because for me it's very important that my book was published in English, translated in English, because I think that the crisis that we are living now in Mexico is not just the problem of the Mexicans. It's the problem of all the citizens in this world that consume illegal drugs. It's the problem also of all the countries of this world that led to these cartels get inside their illegal drugs. So I hope at the end of this chat, maybe we will, you will learn that these drug cartels are not just dangerous for the Mexican, are also dangerous for you, because you never talk about it. Even the government never said who is the head of the drug cartel in USA. They exist. They are here. They are distributing the drugs. They are laundering the dirty money. And they are also a danger for the democracy of this country. So I will start telling you that the reason of why I make this investigation is because on December of 2000, I learned that the corruption hurts. My father was kidnapped and murdered by one gang that works in the Mexico City. In that years, between 1998 and 2000, many businessmen, as my father, were kidnapped and some of them murdered for these gangs. When I went with my family to claim for justice to the police said that if we want justice, if you want justice, you have to pay. If you want that we investigate who did it, you have to give us money. Of course, we decide not give money to the police because you can buy the justice. So until now, I don't know who killed my father, and I have to live with that. I have to live with that, and it's very hard each day. So since then, I decided to start to investigate the corruption in Mexico. I started to be a journalist on 1993, but that moment, in that moment, all my point of view about journalism, about the government changed. So I really start to investigate the corruption in Mexico. First, I just start to investigate the common corruption. I mean like the abuse of power, the bad use of public money, the excess of the presidential family, that kind of things. But in 2005, when I start this investigation, the UNICEF told me, give me a tip, that in one area in Mexico called the Golden Triangle, where is the point that is a point between the states of Chihuahua, Durango, and Sinaloa, exist many kids that were forced to work in the fields of drugs. I mean the fields of marijuana and amapola and poppy. So I went there. Now it's almost difficult to get there because that territory is now under absolute control of the Sinaloa cartel. I went there. I already knew that in that area born the most infamous drug lords in Mexico, like Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo Guzmán, the leader of the Sinaloa cartel. Their cousins, Los Beltrán Leiva, also Rafael Caro Quintero, that he was a very important drug lord that he just be released some weeks ago, and many of these infamous drug lords. So I came there, I went there, and I discovered a story very different than said UNICEF. Yes, these kids were involved since the 7 years old in the drug business, but they did it because they want to. All the kids, all the male kids, since they're 7 years old, start to help to their fathers to grow marijuana and amapola, because their fathers did it too, and the grandfathers too. So that's how these families survive in that part of Mexico. I spent there 5 days. I never see any policeman. I never see any soldier. I never see the government there. So I really asked to myself, well, where is the government here? Why? Of course, the government knows that this is happening, but why nobody is worried about stop this? When I interview that little kids, that little boys, and I asked them, what do you want to do when you grow up? They all of them said, well, I want to be like the Chapo Guzman. I want to have a big truck. I want to have my AK-47, and I want to have a very una muy buena vieja is an expression, a very Mexican expression. That means that very beautiful woman. So it was dramatic. I came back to Mexico. I wrote the story, and at the end of 2005, I received an incredible phone call. It was a lawyer. I was working in that year in the newspaper El Universal. He was the lawyer of the deputy director of Puente Grande, that is the jail where El Chapo Guzman escaped. So the deputy director was in jail because he was accused to help to El Chapo Guzman get out the jail. So I talked with him, and he told me another very different story than the official story. He said that the officials, the directors, the personnel that work in the jail didn't let and didn't help to El Chapo Guzman to escape. He told me that who opened the door to the Chapo Guzman was the federal government. Of course, I didn't believe him. Of course, I just can't believe that story just because one guy is telling me. So I asked him for proofs. I am almost sure that I am the only Mexican journalist that have all the criminal case about the escape of El Chapo Guzman. I mean, thousands documents, official documents, with testimonies, with the records of the CCTV of the jail, and I read all that documents. So I learned through that documents who was really the Chapo Guzman, who helped him to escape. It was true, it was the federal government. And so I discovered this guy, El Chapo. He is a vicious man. He has addicted to sex and drugs. He's alcoholic. He's very violent. He's not able to write a love letter. I mean, he had to leave the school when he was 7 years old. When he was a kid, he was just another kid, like as I saw in the Golden Triangle. He's almost an analphabet. How you said analphabeta?
Yeah,
He can't read.
Yeah.
You're right.
And so when I discovered that in that document, because hundreds of testimonies that the people that met him in jail confessed that things to the government, I discovered another man very different than this huge character that the federal government creates. Yes, the very smart man that can control everything. He was almost nobody. So my question was, who is this man and who made him this? I mean, now this man is the most powerful drug lord in the world, as the DEA said. So that was really my story. That is the story of the book. What I found through 5 years of investigation is that this man exists because the federal government wants. This man exists because he's under the protection of many important businessmen that launder the money of the Sinaloa cartel and also use part of that money in campaigns. I also learned that the Secretary of Public Security in Mexico, in the government of Felipe Calderón, his name is Genaro Garcia Luna, that he was the head of the war against drugs in Mexico. He was really in the payroll of the Sinaloa cartel. He works and protects to the Sinaloa cartel. I was able to document that the federal police not just protect to the Sinaloa cartel, also they traffic drugs and money by the most important airports in Mexico. I mean, from the airport of the Mexico City, from the airport of Cancun, from the airport of Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Tijuana. So that's why Mexico now is living this crisis, because the government is never really want to, the government of Felipe Calderón never really want to fight against the drugs. His government was protecting one cartel and fight against the cartel's enemies of the Sinaloa cartel. That's why all the violence start. When I discovered that, I really want to understand, well, why, if the cartels exist in Mexico since many years ago, why they have a peaceful relationship between them? Why suddenly they start to fight against each other? What I found, also with documents, is that the federal government, since the decade of 60s, until the last day of the government of Ernesto Zedillo, that he was the last president, became from the party of PRI. The federal government used to protect to all the cartels. In Mexico exist different cartels. Each cartel controls one area in Mexico. For example, exists the Gulf cartel that controls Tamaulipas, Veracruz, and Tabasco. Exists el cartel de Juárez, the Juárez cartel, that control the most important part of the frontier between the border between Mexico and USA, and the Tijuana cartel that control the city Tijuana, that is, of course, another very important city to traffic drugs. And that cartels didn't have to fight against each other, because each one was a piece of the cake. The government protects to all of them. Each one has their own business. What changed suddenly? When Vicente Fox became the president in Mexico, the first president from a different party than PRI, he get out from jail to the Chapo Guzman, and his government start to protect to the Sinaloa cartel and the partners of the Sinaloa cartel, and start to use the power of the state against the cartel, the enemy cartels of the Sinaloa cartel, who really start the war against drugs was Vicente Fox, not Felipe Calderón. The war started in 2003 when hundreds of soldiers and policemen of the federal government tried to take the control of Tamaulipas, the territory of the Gulf cartel. The government want to take the control of the territory, not to clean, not to liberate, to the people of the drug cartel. No, they just want to give that territory to the Sinaloa cartel. So in that moment, the leader of the Gulf cartel, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, create Los Zetas. These terrible, horrible organizations, very violent in Mexico, didn't exist before that moment. When the Gulf cartel created Los Zetas to fight against the federal government and to fight against the Sinaloa cartel. When the Sinaloa cartel discovered that the Gulf cartel created Los Zetas, they start to bring to Mexico members of the Mara Salvatrucha, and the violence grows. When the Gulf cartel saw that the Sinaloa cartel start to hire members of the Mara Salvatrucha, they hire caibiles. I don't know if you know what is los caibiles. The caibiles is maybe one of the most terrible armies in elite group of armies in the world. He was an elite group in the army of Guatemala. They were very violent. They cut in pieces their victims. They rape. They do really bad things. The Gulf cartel start to hire them. So that's why the violence in Mexico just start to grow and grow and grow. The only thing that Felipe Calderón did is just continue that line. I mean, he also protect to the Sinaloa cartel and use the power of the state against the enemies of the Sinaloa cartel. Now, at the end of the government of Felipe Calderón, the results of the war against the drugs is now the consume of drugs in Mexico double. Now Mexico is the second most important country that produce marijuana and heroin in the world. It wasn't. When the war against the drugs started, Mexico wasn't so important as now. And then, also now Mexico is a very important producer of methamphetamines, and now we have this very important and powerful drug cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, that now is the most important cartel in the world. What kind of war against drugs can have that result? What kind of war against drugs can make the business bigger? So that's why I said that the war against drugs of Felipe Calderón was a shame, was false, wasn't true. And I think that the US government took a wrong decision, help to Felipe Calderón in that war through the Plan Mérida. The US government put too much of your money, because it's your money, don't forget that, it's your money, to help to kill people in Mexico. So, what is happening in Mexico is also your problem. Now, these cartels, the Sinaloa cartel, the Gulf cartel, the Los Zetas, are also here. Exist documents of the State Departamento de Estado? State Department that proves the presence of these cartels inside USA, and I really want to know what will happen. Why the U.S. government hasn't stopped the drug and the drug cartels. I always think, you have every day a huge white elephant just walking and crossing the border each day. Tons of cocaine each day. And no one see the elephant. The elephant also is walking in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and nobody see the huge, big, white elephant? Cannot be. This elephant walk in the streets of New York because you also have corruption here. Because here also exist officials that protect that business. So I hope really that you were able to read the book and understand a little bit more what is happening in Mexico, and that what is happening in Mexico is also your problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Anabel. It's important before I ask Nick to speak about human rights work in Mexico. I would like to add that since 2010, shortly after she wrote the book, Anabel received really serious death threats, and since then she has been assigned police protection 24/7. Yeah. Anyway, Nick.
Okay, well that's an impossible act to follow, but I'll try and be relatively concise, and I'd like to touch a little bit on a point that I think will complement a theme that Anabel talked about, which is, in Mexico, the government, especially under Calderón, but even now under Peña Nieto, likes to set up a dichotomy, and they like to talk about, los malos, which are the drug cartels on one side, y los buenos, which are the police and the army and all of the people that are charged with protecting the rights of people in Mexico. And I actually think, and I'd be curious in the discussion, that if you share this, that I think actually in many parts of Mexico, before the drug violence arrived, that people actually believe this. In fact, in Mexico, the most popular institution in the country, more popular than the Catholic Church, which, unlike here, is extremely popular in Mexico, is the army. And this may be in part because Mexico is one of the only places in Latin America where the army kind of never overthrew the government, so they don't have this bad legacy that you have in so many other countries. But in 2006, when former President Calderón was elected and took the decision, as Anabel talked about, he wasn't the first person to send the army to combat cartels, but he did it at a level that was pretty much unprecedented. He sent about 50,000 soldiers to the parts of Mexico under the premise that drug consumption was increasing and that violence was increasing. Two premises that, as Anabel pointed out, were actually false. Right? Drug consumption prior to sending the army into the streets and violence prior to sending the army into the streets was not increasing. I mean, it was increasing in certain parts of the country, but not dramatically. What it increased was after the army showed up. Right? And the pattern that we saw in Mexico that started in Juarez and then migrated in a very, almost like a virus or an epidemic, to later to Monterrey, now to Jalisco, to Veracruz, is that when the army showed up, the violence peaked. When federal police were sent in the thousands to make your community safer, you actually became immediately less safe. And from the perspective of citizens, what we were able to document is that many people were highly, believed very deeply that the army was coming to protect them until the army showed up at their door and took the youngest boy in the house out because he was a certain age and looked a certain way. Or because someone was picked up for walking on a street, taken to a military base, and tortured to confess to a crime that they hadn't committed. Human rights abuses under Calderón, you can talk a lot about the numbers. The numbers increased about tenfold. Killings, at the beginning of the Calderón administration, maybe 2 to 3,000 people were being killed in what the government described as drug-related violence. By the end of the Calderon administration, there were 15,000 people a year that fell into that category. It's a conservative count. But I think that the most important thread that runs across all of the cases that we look at, we've spent a lot of time documenting torture cases and cases of killings and cases of disappearances, and that is that none of these cases are investigated. None of them. It doesn't matter what the profile of the victim is. It doesn't matter whether, in theory, the army is responsible or a criminal group. The response that families encounter is like the one that Anabel had the first time she went, or worse. I spent a lot of time with families who disappeared, and the common response that usually mothers get when they go to police stations, which itself requires a huge degree of bravery to walk into a police station, because oftentimes people know that local police are probably involved in what's happened to someone that they love. When they walk in, usually the most common response in Spanish they would say es que andaba en malos pasos. That he was on the wrong track. If something, the argument has been that if something bad happens to you, it's because you were doing something bad. Right? Now this was a message that you found in every local police station and prosecutor's office, but it was also a message that during the Calderon years came from the very top down, because Calderon spent his entire administration saying, he said this in the US when he came here every year for the General Assembly, he said it when he met with Obama, that 90% of the victims of drug-related violence were criminals. Which, when we did an interesting thing about halfway through the Calderon administration, which is we said, if you can tell us that 90% of the victims and the people responsible are criminals, that means you've investigated most of these cases, right? That you've arrived at a conclusion. At this point, this was about the halfway point of the Calderon administration. There were 35,000 drug-related homicides at this point. We asked the Calderon administration through their equivalent of FOIA requests. Many times, we kept putting in more and more requests. We said, tell us how many investigations you've opened into these 35,000 homicides at the federal level. They managed to kind of refuse and reject the requests for many, many months, and finally we got one that stuck. And these are the numbers that we got back. At a time when 35,000 people had been killed in drug-related violence, the government had opened 997 investigations. And of those 997 investigations, they had charged people in about 300 cases, and they had sentenced people in 21 cases, right? So what you realize, what those statistics tell us is something that you know every time you meet a family member of someone who's been killed or tortured or disappeared in Mexico, which is that they're not even bothering to open investigations, let alone finishing it, right? And so this whole myth that was perpetuated by the government that this is criminal on criminal violence, that these are bad guys and that, let them kill each other because it's for the best, they'll eliminate each other, was built on nothing. There was no foundation for it. Everyone is, I think I want to leave a lot of time for Anabel in the discussion. I want to talk very briefly about disappearances, which is something that we've worked on a lot in Mexico. I think that prior to what began to happen recently in Mexico, I think a lot of people thought of disappearances as a thing of the past in Latin America, as something that had happened during the dirty wars, and that thankfully we hadn't seen anything on the scale of this. When we started to look into disappearances in 2007 and 2008, the first families were starting to come forward, and the response of the government at that time was, if your son went missing, he probably went away with his girlfriend, or he probably just broke off contact with you because you had a problem in your relationship. These were cases where the mother would say, no, actually I saw my son, he was picked up by a police officer, here's the number of the unit that picked him up. But for years, the government wouldn't acknowledge that any of these cases were happening. And then eventually they got to a place where they said, there are a few isolated cases here and there. In February of this year, we had spent several years working on documenting cases of disappearances in Mexico. We released a report in February after the new government came to power, the Peña Nieto government. And there had been lists that had leaked that suggested that many people had been disappearing, but the government had been denying it. The day that we released this report coming out of this meeting, the government acknowledged that a list that had been circulating that they had denied was real, that had 26,122 names on it, was real. In other words, 26,000 plus people had disappeared in the previous 6 years in Mexico, and the government had no idea what had happened to them. This is something that is at a scale that we haven't seen since the Dirty Wars in Latin America. In Argentina, correct me if I'm wrong, approximately 10,000 is the number, the dirty 10 to 14,000 is the dirty war figure.
Yeah, a little more, in fact.
Under Pinochet, you know, not these numbers, if they are real, and these cases aren't being investigated, so we can't say, you know, it would constitute certainly one of, if not the most serious crisis in disappearance in Latin America in decades. Now, what's changed with the new government? A lot in the way they talk about the problem. You know, Calderon spent 6 years saying that human rights abuses weren't happening, and the Peña Nieto government came out and fully acknowledged that terrible things had happened, but they'd happened in the past. You know, that chapter was closed, that Mexico was now booming economically, and that they were going to turn a page and this was a new Mexico. I was in Chihuahua last month. There are new cases of disappearances. There are new cases of torture. There are new cases of executions. There are whole towns where dozens of men of a certain age are being disappeared, and nobody will come forward to denounce it because they know that authorities are involved and they're too afraid that they're going to be taken. We met with an association of mothers on this visit. One of the mothers told us that the association stopped meeting when the most prominent of the mothers, the most kind of vocal, who had really gone and knocked on the door of the police station every day to demand an investigation into her son's disappearance, had herself been disappeared. And then they disbanded. I want to close by giving you a sense of what these cases are like and tell you about one case that we documented in our last report. It's a case of a group of family members from León, which is in Guanajuato in the middle of Mexico, who went every year on a hunting trip to Zacatecas. Now Zacatecas, as Anabel can tell you, is basically as bad as things get in Mexico now, I think, with Tamaulipas and a couple other states in terms of the levels of violence and the lack of a presence of any government officials, any order at all. They were returning from this hunting trip, and they were stopped by police in a small town in Zacatecas. The police took them to a police station. There were 10 family members. One of them was 15. Otherwise, they were all grown men. And started to torture them. Because what they believed was if these guys had rifles in the back of the car, that they were from a rival group that was showing up to set up shop. And from the police station, they called the Zetas. And they said, we have these guys. We're pretty sure they're from another group. Do you want them? And the Zeta said, you know, first find out if they're from another banda, if they're from another group. So they tortured them, and basically they realized the truth, which is these guys were on a hunting trip. But the Zeta said, you know what, bring them to us anyway. So they took these guys in a couple cars to a gas station, and we have the surveillance camera footage from the gas station. The police showed up at the gas station. The Zetas showed up at the gas station. They took these guys out of the car. They gave them to the Zetas. Now, two of the people in the group of 10 managed to escape. One who was 15, the Zetas let him go because he was a kid. And the other, when they were executing the other men one by one, ran away and managed to escape in the desert. And we've spoken to them. And there is no question in this case, first, that the police were involved, that the lines between the good guys, the police, and the Zetas are non-existent. They're part of the same group. The police report to the Zetas. And I think what's very telling in this case is that even though the surveillance camera footage came out, even though we know the police units that were involved in this crime, the police were charged, but they were never sentenced. So you have these cases, these paradigmatic cases where you do all the work, like the work that Anabel did, and you can say, no, what happened here was this. You know, this army unit showed up on this day, and they took this person. Here are photographs of the army unit. here are the names of the people who were working that night. You can give every single piece of evidence to the government, and nothing happens. And I think the only thing that you can conclude from that is that the problem is not that these are exceedingly complicated cases to get to the bottom of. The problem is that they don't want to hold responsible the people who are held accountable. And you can only end up at Anabel's conclusion, which is that this benefits certain people. It's in their interest to protect other people, and these are very powerful forces in Mexico, and it can be extremely discouraging. I think to end on not a terrible note, if there is something to take a bit of hope away from, we work with a lot of families in doing this work, and it is very affirming to see, 65-year-old mothers who don't know how to read, who have primary school education, in police stations, slamming on a desk and demanding that prosecutors go out and arrest a person because the mothers have done the whole entire investigation in the case, and we see that all the time in Mexico. So I think if Mexico is going to make it through this period, it will be because of the pressure of families and victims in the cases that really didn't refuse to stay silent. They're exceptional. They're people like Anabel who are assuming the risk of speaking out. But I think that's a national service at this point. So thank you.
Thank you. I have a few questions for both of you, and then we'll open it for the public. All right.
Right.
Anabel, as Nick said, he thinks there hasn't been changes in Mexico, but there has been a change in government. The PRI is back in power after 2 sexenias, right? We have a new president, Enrique Peña Nieto. Has something changed in terms of violence since Peña Nieto took office, or level of violence remains the same? How's the situation? What we see is at least the government has been successful to get the violence out of the cover of the papers, at least, right? Out of the.
Well, I think it's soon to say what will happen with this government. But what I can say is I really see very bad signs about what is happening now. From January to July of this year, 10,000, I will say the official numbers, 10,000 people have been murdered by the violence of the drug cartels in Mexico. 2,000 people per month. So the violence is still be there. The federal government said, and now there are less murders in Mexico because they assume in the last year was 10,001. Something like, really? And it says, yes, we are doing fine. No, of course, we are talking about thousands of people murdered. And second, the same bad guys that are inside the institutions. I mean, the general prosecutor, attorney, yeah?
The attorney general?
No, the PGR.
Yeah, the Attorney General.
Just the Attorney General, the Army, in the Marines, in the Federal Police, all the bad people that works for the cartels still being in charge, still being there. And the third thing is that in January, Enrique Peña Nieto started to say that, well, I have my strategy against the drug cartels. We will see what happened in 1 year with my strategy. And everyone said, what is that strategy? Nobody knows it. Nobody knows which is the strategy. How can you evaluate in 1 year if it was correct or not correct, if it was successful or not, if you don't know what is the strategy? So I think that really nothing changed. Nothing have changed. And I agree that now just the government tried to change the words, try to change the way to to call the things, to call the problems. Now it's terrible. Now in Mexico start to appear paramilitary groups that the government called them
Self-defense groups.
Self-defense. But many of that groups are under control of the drug cartels, and the government let them exist.
I know, it's difficult to be an investigative journalist in Mexico today. What were the main challenges you face while conducting your research or investigation? What would you say were the main challenges? Well, sources, were open to talk to you, or?
It has been very, very, very difficult. These people really want to kill me. The people that want to kill me is not El Chapo Guzmán or Miguel Ángel Treviño, the leader of Los Zetas. The people that want to kill me is the people that was hired, that was escondida, hidden. Yeah. The people that that pretend to be legal, pretend to be decent, but they are protecting and they are part of the cartels. The man who want to kill me is Genaro Garcia Luna, that now is in Miami, drinking rum, I think, and, spending the dirty money that the Sinaloa cartel pay him. And as well, Felipe Calderón is in Harvard. I know what he's drinking, but I'm sure he is. And it's terrible. And I have to really pay a very high price to do this, but also my informants. I have to say that many of my informants have been killed. I had a very important informant, the General Mario Arturo Acosta Chaparro. He is the General X in my book, and he was murdered in April of the last year, just in April of 2012, just a few months before the government of Felipe Calderón end. Other of my sources were put in jail by the government of Felipe Calderón, and many others disappears. Now be a journalist with all this record is horrible, but because of course many people neither want to talk me, don't want to talk me. I have lost many friends. I have to be segregated. I lost my life. I put in very serious danger the life of my mother and my sisters, and I have to live with that. And I have to live with that because I really believe in good journalism. I think that good journalism can change the story. We have many examples in the world that can happen. I really think that if I do well my job, I can build a better country for my kids. And because I really learned that corruption hurts, and it hurts all the time.
Anna, I'd like your opinion on, you're one of the top investigative reporters in the country. You work in Mexico City. You have police custody 24/7, right? What are the implications of this situation for journalists that work in Tamaulipas, Veracruz? How can they do their work? How can they look into crime, corruption, human rights abuses, in areas that are completely under the control of the organized crime groups?
It's very sad to answer that they can't. They can't do their jobs. Now we have in Mexico many parts of the country with silence. Nobody want to publish the stories. Nobody want to publish what is happening. The media, most of the media, local or national media, press, radio, television, is on the control of the government, the local government or the federal government, because they depend of the money of the government by advertising. Mm-hmm. And if they publish something uncomfortable for the government cut the money. And when one journalist, because I really know many journalists that really want to make their jobs, but they can't. Because when they went to his newspaper and put the story over the desk of the editor said, no, I will not publish this, no. And if the journalist start to be threatened, the media hire the journalist, and the journalist has to run away to some other place. They are coming to the Mexico City, but in the Mexico City, no one wants to protect them. The federal government don't want to protect to the journalist. The National Commission of Human Rights is not able to do it neither. And what we are trying to do now is to start to protect to each other. Many of these journalists came with their families without food, shelter, or job. So one organization called Periodistas de a Pie, Reporteros Sin Fronteras, and other organizations start to organize conference, to ask for the people money to take care about our partners. So it's very hard. I think that it's sad to say that as a journalist, you can't really know who's worse, the cartels or the government, because many times they are just the same.
Nick, before we open it to the public, I'd like to have your opinion. You know, Human Rights Watch report on disappearances found that there's widespread involvement of military and security forces, but the victims have not been found, and very few people have been brought to justice. Right? What are the consequences of this culture of pervasive impunity for Mexicans?
I think for the families that are affected by this, it's a before and after moment for families, right? I mean, it's very common that you hear, often it's the parents that are looking for their children. And one of the things pretty much across the board parents will tell you is that I can't pay attention and focus on my other children until I find my child that's missing, right? So it's inside the families, it's devastating, right? And it's made worse, oftentimes people ask us, this is such a big problem, what could the government do to fix it? I'll give you one very simple example of something that would make lives of families much easier, families that disappeared. In Mexico, basic social services, healthcare and education, especially for the poor, are tied to having a job. Oftentimes, the people who are taken are the heads of household, they're young men, they have families. And as if it's not bad enough that your husband has been disappeared, that nobody's looking for him, that people are saying he's a criminal when he was a working class guy, you then go to take your son or your daughter to childcare and they say, your husband's not reporting to work, you have no childcare. Or you go for health benefits and you're turned away. This is something that can be fixed so easily. This is a bureaucratic fix. The government has known about this. The last government knew about it. We presented it to Peña Nieto's cabinet in February. They said they were going to fix it. They still haven't. So that's on a small level. But I think, there's something that they talk about, a term that they use in Mexico a lot, which is tejido social, the social fabric of communities. And outside of places like Mexico City, you can feel very palpably the impact on whole communities that this has, right? So, just to give one other example, we were documenting cases in a place in northern Nuevo León, close to the US border. And we had gone to meet one family who we knew this family had come to report a disappearance. And, their son was a taxi driver. The Navy showed up in the middle of the night. They took him out. He was never seen again. And we started to go around and talk to some of the neighbors, and what we realized very quickly was that actually a lot of people had been taken in this tiny town. But the neighbors were so afraid, and they were so isolated by what had happened to them that none of them had talked to each other. Like, none of them realized that the guy 3 doors down, the son of people that were their friends, had been taken because everyone was so terrified. So when you multiply that times an entire country of communities where these little incidents happen, and the response is what Anabel's described. I mean, rather than coming together, this actually isolates people, and people are shamed, and they're made to feel like the same thing the government said. If something bad happened to your son, it's probably because he was involved in something bad and he probably deserved it. Until it happens to them, it's devastating. And it's going to take, I think, not years, but I mean a generation to fix. And the way to fix it is not what's happening now. It's not to pretend that, that as this government has, that yes, we understand terrible things happen. This is a new Mexico and we're dealing with it, and we have a handsome president, and he's charming, and he's very charismatic, and he's selling a Mexico to the world that is different, and that's how we want to be known. You don't get to move on until you deal with these crimes, and that's what they're trying to do.
Thanks so much. Well, I'd like to open it to the public. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand, identify yourself.
And also, if you could wait for the microphone, because we are recording all of this, and if you could keep your comments and questions relatively brief so we can accommodate a lot of people.
I was wondering, I think since Peña Nieto came to power, sort of there's two solutions to the problem of drugs and the drug wars that I've heard that I would just love to hear your comments on. One is what he suggested vaguely when he first came to power, to take money, to stop investing money in military solutions and to invest money in social services instead, as a way of trying to solve the problems of some of these more violent communities. And the other is the legalization of drugs in Mexico or in Latin America. I think that's also come from other presidents in Latin America. I wonder whether you think that either of these are viable, if they would actually solve the corruption or violence in these communities.
Well, of course, I'm agree that the government they have to spend more money in education, in hospitals, and that kind of things. But I have to say something. La pobreza es
Poverty.
The poverty is not the cause of what is happening in Mexico. I born in 1971. Since I was a child, my father told me that in Mexico was 50 million of people in poverty. Why all that millions in poverty didn't get involved with the drug cartels? Why the young boys in all that years didn't get involved and start to kill each other? Why? What happened? The impunity is not the poverty. The problem. The answer is not the poverty? The answer is impunity. Now, one of these young guys, young boys, that doesn't have any opportunity to go to school, to get a job, as always, now they know that if they get involved with one drug cartel, they will never get in jail. Never get in jail. It's more easy that the enemy of the other cartel kill him than he get in jail. So the impunity is the corruption, and impunity is like a sisters, are the big problem in Mexico. It's good that the government put more money in education, but the government have to clean the government. The government have to show that impunity doesn't exist anymore. The government can say, oh, well, now this is a new Mexico, let's go. No, they have to resolve all that mess first. Because without justice, any country can exist. The impunity have to end. That is really the biggest problem. And I think really, I'm not an expert about legalization of drugs. I have to confess that I'm very conservative about that, because I really think, I have 2 kids, I really think that drugs are bad. And I think that the legalization of the drugs is not the answer now. I think that every country in the world really have to start fight against the cartels and the drug. I really believe that in any part of the world exists a true war against the drug cartels, because if the government really want to fight against the drug cartel, first, they have to take the money. They have to put in jail all the businessmen and the directors of the banks, not just ask for a multa, how you said? Fine. Put them in jail because they are laundering the money of these cartels. Put in jail all the senators, congressmen, governors that are involved. Start a very huge campaign against the consume of drugs, because everything is about a business. Everything is about the market. If the market is still growing, the drug cartels, of course, will grow. So stop the market. I really, in all that 6 years of the government of Vicente Fox, almost didn't exist any campaign against the consume of drugs. That's why the market grew. So I really think that the world is not yet prepared to think about the legalizations. And also, when some states here, Colorado and which is the other one? Washington. Start to legalize the marijuana now is just a little part of a huge chain of crime. I mean, now the drug cartels not just control the traffic of drugs, they also control the piracy, they also control the child pornography, they also control the human traffic, and many other terrible crimes. So you can legalize a very small part of the business, but the other part of the business is still existing. So the legalize of the drugs is not the answer. That's what I think.
There in the back.
There.
Sorry.
Can you hold on one second?
Just can you hold for the?
Robert Jareski from Friends of Brad Will, friendsofbradwill.org. About 7 years ago, it'll be in October, that U.S. journalist Brad Will was murdered in broad daylight in Oaxaca in front of witnesses and with pictures taken of the gunmen who've all been identified and who were members of the local government. Our network was fighting for accountability for his murder and for the murder of 26 other innocent people, Oaxaqueños, who were killed by, according to Physicians for Human Rights, the Nobel Prize-winning organization that went down and did forensic analysis. They said that the paramilitaries, government-backed paramilitaries, were the likely culprits of these murders. Within a year, Bush announced Plan Mexico, Merida Initiative, and we linked our fight for accountability for our friend and these other people to Plan Mexico, because we felt that it was clear that there wasn't any law enforcement cooperation when you have a government that does not arrest the people who shot an American journalist in broad daylight and these other people. We recognize impunity that has stolen so many lives in Mexico. And I guess I'm just wondering, I guess my question is, I mean, why are we surprised at the outcome of Plan Mexico? You know, Plan Colombia, before Plan Colombia was launched, the CIA found that the government was mostly the party that was dealing drugs, that was doing, you know, and then before the Merida Initiative, there were the disappearances in Colombia, right? There's the false positives, people from all over the country being tagged with like, oh, they're a guerrilla, and they're just, they got their kill ratio. And 5 million people displaced from their land in Colombia. So I'm just wondering, you know, this is all so familiar and predictable, and the corruption is here. Of course it's here. It's, you know, the bank that's been laundering money, HSBC, you know, the big premiums on a drug war delivery to the US, going through all those hurdles, will predictably create more drugs coming through, right? Because they've got to get past all this stuff. And I'm just wondering why we're surprised, and you know, what we can do to fight it from our end, which is, you know, Obama's increased Plan Mexico, you know, just, you know, beyond just like looking the other way with the Honduras coup and lots of other things. So I'm just wondering, what can we do for accountability? And I mean, to get justice for Brad, of course, I'm interested in that. And for some people say 100,000 Mexicans have been killed. So.
I really believe that Americans can do much things. When one people consume illegal drugs here, I always hear it's my body, it's my life, it's my problem. No, it's not just only your body. It's not only your life. It's the life of hundreds of thousands of people that is dying in Mexico for that. And I think that if the people get more conscious about what provoke consume of illegal drugs, maybe they will stop. I always use this example in universities. For one kid, one person can be fun, just give some dollars for 1 gram of cocaine. Consume cocaine, have a good party. But this guy, this young man, don't know that with that dollars, he is contributing with a very, very terrible crimes. That dollars can be used to kidnap his little brother, rape it, and use for child pornography. So it's not just your problem. It's not just to take the things like a party. We have to have very more conscience about the world, about the consequence that each decision that we took, like a part of the society. Because if that money is used for kidnap the little brother and be forced in child pornography, it will not be fun. And maybe this young man will never see again to his little brother.
Can I
Sure.
on a couple of points. On the Merida initiative and U.S. engagement in Mexico, first of all, I think the Bradwell case is an excellent example that fits in the pattern of cases where, what makes Bradwell's case exceptional is that he's an American. What makes it unexceptional is that it fits the pattern of cases of many Mexicans who will never have a constituency like Brad's, and whose cases will then have less chance of moving at all. I do think it's important in talking about U.S. policy to Mexico and the Merida initiative to acknowledge a few things. So the U.S. has sent about $2.1 billion to Mexico in Merida aid since the Merida initiative was started under Bush. We sent about $300 to $400 million a year to Mexico under the Merida initiative. When Merida started, most of that aid went to what military people call toys, helicopters, Bell helicopters especially, but also hardware for the Mexican military. There has been an important shift in recent years, and I'm not defending U.S. support, but I just want to put all the pieces on the table, in terms of more money being invested in what I think is the best bang for your buck investment in Mexico, which is justice reform. It's training prosecutors and judges, which is something that Mexico needs very badly. Mexico's in the middle of a justice reform that is fully off the rails and not on track to be implemented by 2016. Another important thing about Merida is that, in theory, 15% of Merida aid every year is supposed to be pegged to 4 human rights conditions, right? One of those human rights conditions, for example, is that Mexico, when military commits abuses, not send those cases to military courts, because military courts have a perfect record, or near perfect record, in that they've opened about 5,000 investigations since 2007 into abuses by the military, and in 4 of those cases have they gotten convictions. 4 out of 5,000. And those are the cases that are reported, right? So we already are dealing with a smaller piece of the pie. To what can Americans do, and where can pressure be exerted? To me, there's a very obvious place, which is that every single year, the State Department under US law is required to report to Congress whether Mexico is meeting those 4 conditions or not. Every year, the US sends a report that says that Mexico is kind of getting close to trying really hard at meeting the conditions. The reality is they're nowhere close to meeting them. So an obvious point of advocacy, I think, for people that are US constituents is to call Congress people, and especially people on the Appropriations Committee, and say, stop sending this 15% of money. It is not, let me put it in perspective though, it's a tiny amount of money. $300 or $400 million that the US sends every year is not the bulk of spending. The bulk of spending is the Mexican government on this. What we're sending is a tiny fraction of what the Mexican government is sending, which doesn't make it okay, but it would be a very symbolic message if the tiny portion of that money that's conditioned to human rights was withheld 1 year, and it still hasn't been withheld. So I think that's a very clear advocacy target for people in the US. And to your question, and I think this is linked, I want to kind of weigh in. I think I have a slightly different perspective from Anabel on the drug issue, which is that I agree 100% that solely pulling on the lever of changing drug policy at this point doesn't change the equation, because less than half of the drug cartels' profits are coming from drugs anywhere. Now, they're coming from everything that Anabel said, that plus extortion and all the other things that they do. We do think, and I say we at Human Rights Watch, we believe that the approach to dealing with the drug problem in general up to now, the war on drugs paradigm, the verdict is in and it hasn't worked, right? The evidence shows that all of the efforts, as Anabel said at the beginning, to combat drug consumption with soldiers and with long prison sentences is a losing formula, right? And so what we believe is that you know, it's not that you can't just go to blanket legalization. That it's actually more complicated than that. But we do believe that there should be a serious discussion about decriminalization, especially of drugs like marijuana. And we think that discussion should happen right now. And we think that it's a very positive sign that certain leaders of important countries that have these problems in Latin America, like Colombia and like Guatemala, are actually talking about this now, that this is very positive. So I don't think it fixes the problem, but I do think that, you know, talking about an approach that deals more with treatment of drug users rather than punishment, and less long prison sentences for small offenders. Prisons in Mexico, for example, are pretty much controlled by organized crime now. You know, they're factories of extortion and punishment for the people that are in them, is a discussion that's not only wise, it's necessary. And so that, I don't think that it gets you to the finish line, but I think to not make it part of the discussion now is irresponsible.
Just to follow up, you know, the discussion.
I just want to let the moderator.
Yes, I'm sorry, we do need to give other people a chance.
Sorry, but we have a few minutes and we want to let other people. Thank you.
I was interested in the reception in Mexico to your book, and I gather that the sales figures of the book are high for a book of nonfiction. Is that right? Were you interviewed on TV, national TV, and the people who bought the book, would they have been surprised at what you were saying, or did they buy the book because it substantiated what they already knew?
Well, you're talking about the reaction. What was the reaction of the government? The people? Yeah, okay.
The people. La gente que compró el libro sabía qué es lo que estaba pasando.
Yeah.
La gente
Well,
sorprendida por lo que.
I really think that the book had success because the official version about what was happening in Mexico didn't fix with the reality. All the people that lives in Monterrey, the people that lives in Chihuahua or in Tamaulipas, obviously think that, well, the government is saying something, but we are living other thing. And I think that the people was searching for answers. And I think that my book gives some of that, gave some of that answers. That's what I think. In conference like this, in Mexico, the people sometimes is surprised, sometimes no. But when they read the book, when they saw the documents in the Spanish version, I put many of the most important documents because I thought that, of course, what I am saying is very strong. I mean, maybe many people cannot believe that. So I decided to put many of the most important documents. So when the people finish the book, the people really believe that, really discover what is the biggest problem in Mexico. It's not the drug cartels, it's the corruption.
Can you, thank you, Anabel, for coming. I guess I'm a little nervous because this is being recorded. I'm Mexican American. I'm from Jalisco. I'm from Los Altos. The region that I'm from is currently under the control of Cartel Nueva Generación, which is an ally with the Sinaloa cartel. And I've been able to see the violence and the silencing and the army coming into our area of the country. And so anyway, I'm a little nervous. But at the same time, I want to challenge, I think, some of your understanding of the relevance of the drug economy. I think that in my region, the North American Free Trade Agreement devastated agricultural production. And many people could migrate to the United States. In fact, migration had been happening for a long time in that region. Now, a lot of people can't migrate because there are very stringent migration policies on the border, and there is also an economic recession. And I think that that has made the drug economy a lot more attractive. I think that I guess I would argue with you that perhaps it's not as easy to deny that poverty is a big factor of the drug economy. The other thing I would say is that I'm a doctoral student here in New York City. I have also been a drug user. I've used marijuana, cocaine, and crystal. And so I think that your idea of who is a drug user and who consumes drugs, I think should be a little more nuanced, because in the United States we have this history of leaders like Nancy Reagan telling us that drugs are bad and they just don't do it, But the reality is that the consumption of drugs is a lot more complicated. And here in the United States, it has a very racial connotation. And I think that advocates of people like me and like you perhaps who are against the drug cartels and the impunity in Mexico have a common cause with people here in New York who are trying to stop and frisk, or NYPD criminalizations of drugs like marijuana. Anyway, I guess I really would like to challenge you that I think legalization here in New York City, in the United States, can play a very important role, and that we have common cause with people of color, people fighting criminalization and the prison system.
Well, I think really that you put the best example in this night. While Nancy Reagan was telling the people, don't consume drugs, in that same moment, his husband, Ronald Reagan, opened the door to the cartel de Medellin. In the decades, yes, so you are not talking a serious campaign against the drug consumes. That was a shame too. She can't just telling to the young people, don't consume drugs, and his husband at the same time opened the door to the cartel de Medellin, to Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, to Rafael Caro Quintero. It doesn't have any sense. I mean, in the history of our lives, we have many lies. I really think that the world didn't try really an important campaign against the drugs. And I really think that because consume of drugs led many money to many people. I don't know, is one of the issues in my book. When Ronald Reagan was the president of USA, and in Nicaragua appeared a government of a communist government, he sent to the CIA to negotiate with Pablo Escobar Gaviria and tell them, well, we open the door, bring your drugs, we let you airplanes, because the cartel also use airplanes of the US government, paid by the US government, and with the condition to use part of that money to support to the Contra Nicaragüense, the group against the communist government. So I really think that the world haven't tried really a very huge campaign against consumed drugs. I mean, when the presidents, Vicente Fox now, Gaviria, many others said, let's legalize drugs. I always said, why all these guys didn't propose that when they were presidents? Vicente Fox has all the power, was the president. Why he didn't say, well, guys, let's legalize drugs? Why all these presidents said that when they are not in the presidency? It's one question. I mean, I don't know the answer, but of course, it's something that I have in my mind. Why? I have never heard any journalist that asked to Vicente Fox why you didn't when you was a president, or to Cesar Gaviria or other guys. Why? I don't know. I know the answer. I just see that it doesn't have too many sense. So I really think that we have to search for another answers before legalize the drugs. That's what I think.
I was going to suggest that we take these two questions. You've had your hands up for a while. If you could maybe do one after the other and let the people respond.
Gertrudis Ordeñana, NYU Stanford student. Anabel, it seems that you've said it all. Is your job done with the citizens of Mexico and the US, or is there anything else that you need to tell them? What's next for you?
Hi, good evening. My name is Eve, and I grew up in Ciudad Juarez, and I was there until the age of 9, and it's very hard for me to see how a place that I consider home has been destroyed over the past decade. I've been in New York for 11 years now, to see that a place that I consider home has just been decimated by violence. And as a kid, I would walk on the street and be able to go to the park with my friends, and now you can't even go to the supermarket to get milk because it's so dangerous. And I know how the system works in terms of the relationship between the United States and Mexico. What has been the response of the Peña Nieto government to the United States in order to kind of combat the demand for drugs on this side of the border?
Well, what's next? That was her question. This problem of the drug cartels is still being a very important problem in Mexico. After I published the book in 2010, even many of my sources have been killed. Even many of my sources are in jail or disappear. Even all the threats of death that I have received, each day I have new informants inside the government that really want to say the truth, that they really want to share the documents, the proofs, just to make that the truth became public. So I will still doing this job. I don't know if forever, I don't know. I really can tell how many days or months more, but I will because I have too much information, and I feel this duty to share that information with the society.
All right.
Nick, do you have any last words?
And about I didn't get very well your
Saying about
which is the position about the Peña Nieto about the consume of drugs in USA.
Has he put pressure on the U.S. government?
any pressure?
Not yet really. I think he hasn't said anything about it.
I mean, I think it's pretty much like an established routine now that like the Mexican president will come over. Calderon went to the U.S. Congress and basically gave them a full scolding for U.S. supplying the arms that were coming into Mexico and being the market for the drugs. So I think Peña Nieto has been, the PRI by its nature is inward looking, and their big principle is sovereignty. So they have, if anything, actually distanced themselves from U.S. cooperation and security and counter narcotics in a way that Calderon was very comfortable giving the U.S. full access to Mexico. But it seems like more than anything, they don't like to talk about the drug issue or violence at all, right? So last week, Joe Biden was in Mexico, and if you watch the press conference, it's almost laughable that that they talk about everything but. It's like the obvious thing that the U.S. and Mexico would have to talk about: drug consumption, violence, arms, danger for people crossing the border. They didn't touch any of it, and I think the PRI is very happy with that. And by the way, so is the Obama administration.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming.